Hi everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, I have a story for you, one that is filled with mystery, power, and tragedy. We're going to travel back in time to discover the rise and fall of the Aztec Empire, from their humble beginnings as wandering people to the splendor of Tenochtitlan, the city that shone like a jewel upon the lake, and finally to their dramatic fall when the Spaniards arrived. This is a tale that feels like a legend, but is all rooted in history. So sit back, relax, and let yourself drift into the past as if you were listening to a bedtime story. Before we begin, don't forget to like the video. Share it with friends who love history. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our future journeys into the past. Now, let's begin the story of the Aztec Empire. Long before the world knew the name of the Aztecs, the Valley of Mexico was already a place of deep mystery and wonder. Imagine a highland basin surrounded by mountains so tall that snow lay upon their peaks even when the valley below was warm. Rivers flowed into this basin, filling a great lake called Texcoco, whose surface shimmered with light, reflecting clouds and volcanoes like a perfect mirror. Along its shores, life thrived. Cornfields stretched into the distance, villages bustled with trade, and ancient peoples such as the Toltecs and Tapanecs had already built their cities and temples. The valley was a land of abundance, a cradle for great civilizations. It was into this place, sometime in the 13th century, that a small and ragged tribe wandered. They called themselves the Mexica, though in time the world would know them as the Aztecs. They had come from a distant northern homeland they called Aztlan, a place half remembered in myth where their ancestors once lived. Their journey south had been long and filled with suffering. Wherever they went, stronger peoples drove them away. They were called barbarians, snake-eaters, wanderers without a true home. But these people carried with them more than just hunger and hardship. They carried faith. Their god, Huitzilopochtli, the god of the sun and war, had chosen them. They believed he guided their every step, whispering that one day they would find a promised land. The sign would be unmistakable: an eagle perched upon a cactus, holding a serpent in its beak. Until they found this vision, the Mexica endured exile and humiliation. They were denied fertile ground and forced into marshy places where crops withered. They worked as mercenaries, fighting wars for others, living always on the edge of survival. But hardship carved them into something sharp, something unyielding. The Mexica became disciplined, hardened, and determined. And then, at last, on a small, swampy island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, they saw it, an eagle, perched on a prickly pear cactus, devouring a serpent. To the Mexica, this was no ordinary sight. It was the fulfillment of prophecy. Here, in the very place others mocked as uninhabitable, they would build their city. Its name was Tenochtitlan. At first, Tenochtitlan was little more than a cluster of huts rising above the water. Neighbors laughed at the Mexica for building in a swamp, but the Mexica knew how to make the impossible possible. They learned, too, coax life from the shallow waters by creating chinampas, floating gardens of reeds and mud anchored by willow trees. These man-made islands produced such abundance that harvests overflowed. What began as survival soon became innovation. Mexico turned the lake itself into their ally. As years passed, their island city grew in strength and beauty. Wooden huts became stone temples. Dirt causeways stretched across the waters, linking the island to the mainland. Canals wound between neighborhoods so that people could travel by canoe as easily as by foot. In time, aqueducts brought fresh spring water from the mountains, and dikes tamed the waters of the lake to prevent floods. At the heart of it all rose the great temple, the Templo Mayor, a pyramid that towered into the sky. One side honored Huitzilopochtli, god of the sun and war. The other side honored Tlaloc, god of rain and fertility. It was here that the Mexica carried out the sacred rituals that, in their eyes, kept the universe alive. For the Mexica believed that the world was a battlefield between the forces of light and darkness. The sun itself needed strength to rise each morning and cross the sky, and that strength came from blood. Human hearts offered upon the temple were food for the gods. Captives from war were brought to the altar, their sacrifice ensuring that the world would not end. To outsiders, this practice was terrifying. To the Mexica, it was holy, the highest duty of a chosen people. But life in Tenochtitlan was not only temples and rituals. The city thrummed with energy. Markets overflowed with cacao, cotton, obsidian blades, turquoise jewelry, and the bright feathers of tropical birds. Nobles dressed in garments woven with gold and jade. Poets recited verses about love and death, about the fleeting beauty of flowers and song. Warriors painted their faces, trained in combat, and dreamed of glory on the battlefield. Tenochtitlan, once mocked as a swampy village, was becoming a jewel of Mesoamerica. Still, the Mexica were not yet masters of their world. The valley around them was filled with powerful city-states. Chief among these was Azcapotzalco, ruled by the Tapanic people. The Mexica served as their subjects, their warriors hired out as mercenaries in Tapanic wars. Though their city was growing, they remained beneath the shadow of stronger neighbors. Yet ambition smoldered in their hearts. They had endured too much to remain forever as servants. The chance to break free came in the early 15th century. Maxilla, the Tapanic king, grew greedy and cruel. He demanded more tribute, more warriors, more submission. The Mexica, under their leader, Itzcoatl, saw opportunity. They joined forces with two other cities, Texcoco and Tlacopan, together. They waged war against Azcapotzalco. After bitter battles, Maxilla was defeated, and the great Tapanic city fell. Out of this victory was born the Triple Alliance, a partnership that changed the fate of the Mexica forever. The Triple Alliance was not an equal friendship. Though Texcoco and Tlacopan were powerful, Tenochtitlan soon emerged as the strongest. Together, they expanded across the valley and beyond, demanding tribute from conquered towns. Food, gold, cotton, feathers, jade, and human captives flowed into the capital. The Mexica had thrown off the yoke of their masters and now wore the crown of empire. Itzcoatl, their ruler, understood the power of memory. He ordered the destruction of old histories and records, replacing them with a version that glorified the Mexica. Their humble beginnings as despised wanderers were not forgotten, but reimagined as part of divine destiny. They had suffered because the gods had prepared them for greatness. Now, the world was theirs to claim. With each passing decade, the empire expanded. Wars raged not only for land, but for the captives needed for sacrifice. Boys grew up knowing that to capture an enemy alive was the highest honor. Those who succeeded rose through the ranks, joining elite warrior societies such as the Jaguar, Knight, and the Eagle Warriors. These men wore animal skins, their helmets shaped like snarling beasts, their shields shining brightly in the sun. To be chosen among them was to walk in glory. Yet, not every war was fought for conquest. The Aztecs also waged what they called flower wars. These were battles arranged with neighboring states, fought not to destroy, but to capture prisoners for sacrifice. In these conflicts, warriors displayed their skill and courage, knowing that defeat might mean their own hearts would be offered upon the altar. To die in such a way was not shameful, but honorable, for it meant becoming part of the eternal struggle that kept the sun alive. Life and death were woven together in the Aztec thought. Their poets spoke of how even jade breaks, even gold wears away, even feathers lose their brightness. Life was fleeting, like a flower that blooms only to fade. But in battle, in sacrifice, in honor, one could achieve a kind of eternity. Still, resentment brewed among the peoples forced to pay tribute. The Aztec Empire demanded much too much, some said. Towns sent maize, beans, cacao, cotton, and laborers to Tenochtitlan, often leaving little for themselves. Many obeyed out of fear, but bitterness grew. Some dreamed of revenge, waiting for the moment when the empire's grip might falter. But for now, the sun was rising higher. Tenochtitlan's power stretched far across Mesoamerica. Its temples gleamed in the sunlight, its markets bustled with traders, its canals shimmered with canoes. From a swampy island, the Mexica had built a city that was the envy of all. An age of glory was dawning. With the fall of their old masters behind them, the Mexica stood at the threshold of greatness. Their city, once scorned, was now the center of a rising empire. Under the leadership of Itzcoatl and those who followed him, Tenochtitlan became a place of ambition, ceremony, and power. The warriors returned from campaigns laden with spoils. Priests oversaw rituals to feed the gods, and nobles directed the steady flow of tribute pouring into the capital. It was said that in Tenochtitlan one could find every wonder of the land, from the precious feathers of the quetzal bird to cacao beans used as currency, from finely worked jade to cotton garments softer than clouds. After Itzcoatl came Moctezuma I, a ruler of vision and discipline. He was not yet the Moctezuma who would meet the Spaniards. That story lay further ahead, but an earlier namesake. Remembered as Moctezuma Il Hicamina, his reign brought the empire into a golden age. The reach of Tenochtitlan beyond the valley itself, deep into distant lands where the Mexica had once been unknown. Tribute arrived from mountains, valleys, and coastlines. Salt, gold, jaguar skins, turquoise, cacao, and maize filled the storerooms. Of the capital, Moctezuma also strengthened the city itself. He ordered the construction of aqueducts to bring fresh water from Chapultepec, ensuring the people had what they needed to grow and thrive. He expanded the Templo Mayor, making it an even greater symbol of Mexica power, its twin temples dedicated to the gods of sun and rain rising above the lake like a beacon. The city was transformed not only into a political capital, but into a sacred one, a place where the divine and the earthly met. To live in Tenochtitlan in these days was to live at the center of a world in motion. The markets were said to hold tens of thousands of people, each stall overflowing with goods. Merchants, known as Pochteca, traveled far and wide, bringing back treasures from distant regions. They were not only traders, but also spies, gathering intelligence for the empire's rulers. Every day, the city pulsed with the energy of exchange, of voices shouting, of canoes gliding across the canals carrying produce, wood, and fish. For the common people, life was structured by duty. Boys were trained from an early age to work, to serve, and eventually to fight. Girls learned the arts of weaving, cooking, and managing the household. Marriage was arranged, but life was filled with ceremony, with feasts and festivals that tied each stage of existence to the gods. From birth to death, no moment was free of ritual. Even the act of eating maize was a sacred exchange, for the people believed themselves to be made from the very flesh of corn. But the heart of the Mexica identity was war. Their empire depended on conquest, and conquest demanded warriors. Capture an enemy alive was more honorable than to kill him, for a living captive could be offered to the gods. Thus, courage was measured not only by skill with the obsidian-edged sword, the macuhuitl, but by the ability to seize and subdue. A warrior who captured 4 enemies could join the ranks of the nobility, dine at the royal palace, and wear clothing that marked his status. It was a society where bravery opened doors to glory. These years were marked by triumph, but also by a hunger that could never be fully satisfied. The empire grew outward, but every conquest created obligations, resentments, and enemies. Tribute was demanded regularly, often in staggering amounts, and those who resisted were punished with brutal campaigns. Some peoples accepted their fate, seeing little hope of resistance. Others submitted outwardly, but held hatred in their hearts, waiting for a day when fortune might turn. Even as the empire grew, its rulers understood that survival required not only conquest, but also spectacle. Great festivals were held to honor the gods, festivals filled with dance, music, and offerings. The people of Tenochtitlan saw themselves as living within a cosmic drama, one where the sun required nourishment and the earth demanded sacrifice. Without their rituals, without the blood of warriors, they believed the universe itself would collapse. It was in this time that the empire began to reach beyond the valley, extending its influence far into the south and the coasts. Expeditions marched into the lands of the Mixtec and Zapotec, wresting tribute from proud and ancient peoples. Along the Gulf Coast, towns sent cotton, cacao, and brilliant feathers to Tenochtitlan. The Mexica were no longer merely a regional power. They were building a dominion that spanned mountains and jungles, deserts and lakes. Yet even as the empire shone, the shadow of unrest followed. The Tlaxcalans, fierce warriors who lived east of the valley, refused to bow to Mexica power. They resisted again and again, their defiance becoming a thorn in the empire's side. Instead of crushing them outright, the Aztecs fought them in ritualized conflicts, the so-called flower wars. These wars, though bloody, did not destroy Tlaxcala. Instead, they maintained a state of enmity, ensuring a steady supply of captives for sacrifice. It was a strange relationship, one born of religion as much as politics, but one that would have grave consequences in the years to come. Meanwhile, Tenochtitlan itself grew ever more magnificent. Canals and causeways made it a city of both land and water, often compared to Venice by those who would later see it with foreign eyes. Palaces of the nobility glittered with mosaics of turquoise and shell. Gardens bloomed with flowers brought from faraway lands, a display of wealth and empire. Poets composed verses about life's fragility, likening human existence to flowers that bloom briefly before fading. Warriors, priests, and merchants alike shared in a sense of destiny, that they were chosen to keep the balance of the cosmos, to nourish the gods so that life would endure. But destiny has two faces, and the same belief that gave the Aztecs strength also demanded an endless cycle of war and sacrifice. The empire had become mighty, but it was built upon foundations that would one day prove fragile. For each tribute demanded, resentment deepened. For each captive taken, an enemy's desire for vengeance grew sharper. Though Tenochtitlan sparkled like a jewel upon the waters of Lake Texcoco, beyond its shining surface lay currents of discontent waiting to rise. Still, in these years of Moctezuma, the first, and the rulers who followed him, the empire reached toward its zenith. Festivals filled the calendar with sacred moments, each one tied to a god, a cycle of planting, harvest, rain, and war. The city's population swelled, its people secure in the belief that their empire was not only powerful but eternal. No one could imagine that only a few decades later, strangers from across the sea would arrive, bringing with them forces that no prophecy had foretold. For now, the Aztec sun burned brightly in the sky. Tenochtitlan stood as the heart of a world that pulsed with life, with beauty, with blood. Its rulers looked outward, toward conquest and glory, unaware that the seeds of their own undoing were already being sown. After the reign of Moctezuma the First, the Mexica rulers who followed built upon his foundation, each adding new conquests, new monuments, new wealth to the empire. The city of Tenochtitlan grew ever larger, its temples higher, its markets fuller, its streets busier with people from every corner of Mesoamerica. It became a magnet that drew riches and tribute like a sun pulling planets into orbit. And as the city flourished, the rulers became ever more ambitious, seeking to project their power not just through war, but through the very grandeur of their capital, among the rulers who carried the empire. Forward was Executal. He was young when he came to power, yet he led campaigns that extended Mexica's influence. He ordered the creation of the great circular sunstone, a massive carving that symbolized their understanding of time and the cycles of creation and destruction. Though his reign saw triumph, it also brought defeat when his armies faced the Tarascans to the west, fierce warriors who repel the Mexica with weapons of copper and bronze. This loss was a reminder that even the most powerful empire had limits. Though in the heart of Tenochtitlan, such setbacks did little to slow the rhythm of daily life. After Axayacatl came rulers who rebuilt, expanded, and solidified what he had begun. Tizac remembered more for his building projects than his conquests, oversaw the reconstruction of the great temple. Then came Ayitzatl, perhaps the most ferocious of them all, a warrior king whose name struck fear across the land. Under Ayitzatl, the Aztec Empire reached its widest expanse. His armies marched far south into lands of dense jungles, bringing back treasures of jade, cacao, cotton, and exotic animals that astonished the people of Tenochtitlan. Tribute from conquered towns flowed into the city in such abundance that the capital seemed to burst with wealth. Ahitzotl also enlarged the great temple once more, making it taller and more imposing than ever. When it was rededicated, the ceremonies were said to last for days, with countless captives sacrificed to honor the gods. To the Mexica, this was the fulfillment of destiny, proof that the gods favored their empire. The temple stood not just as stone and mortar, but as the very axis of the universe, a place where heaven and earth met, where blood was given to keep the sun alive. Life in Tenochtitlan under Ahitzotl was marked by spectacle. Processions filled the streets with dancers, musicians, and priests dressed as gods. Gardens bloomed with flowers brought from distant lands. Zoos and aviaries housed jaguars, pumas, and brilliantly colored birds, living symbols of the empire's reach. The markets overflowed with goods: maize from the valleys, cacao from the tropics, obsidian from the mountains, cotton and salt from the coasts. Pochteca merchants became ever more important, their journeys stretching across mountains and deserts, their knowledge of distant lands vital to the empire. Yet Ahutsotel's reign also brought challenges. The expansion of the empire created unrest among subject peoples who chafed under the weight of tribute. Rebellions had to be put down with brutal force, leaving behind scars of resentment. Flood struck Tenochtitlan, reminding the people that their city, for all its glory, was still at the mercy of nature. But these troubles seemed small compared to the splendor of the empire at its height. And then came Moctezuma II, the ruler whose name would echo through history. When he took the throne, he inherited an empire, vast and glittering, but also fragile beneath the surface. Moctezuma was not only a warrior, but a priestly figure, deeply devout, cautious, and steeped in ritual. He ruled with a solemn majesty, surrounding himself with ceremony and distance. Where earlier rulers had walked among their people, Moctezuma withdrew into the grandeur of the palace, elevating the throne into something almost divine. He centralized power more than ever before, demanding obedience not only from conquered towns, but from his own nobles. His reign deepened the sense that the ruler of the Mexica was not just a king, but the living representative of the gods on earth. Under Moctezuma II, the empire continued its traditions of war, tribute, and ceremony. Flower wars with Tlaxcala still raged. Battles fought less for conquest than for the sacred prisoners demanded by the gods. Tribute still flowed into Tenochtitlan, feeding its markets, building its palaces, filling its temples with offerings. Yet Moctezuma also seemed to sense unease. The empire was large, but rebellions simmered constantly. The Tlaxcalans, though surrounded, still resisted. The Tarascans remained defiant in the west, and rumor spread of strange events, summons in the sky, temples struck by lightning, fire consuming buildings without cause, and voices heard in the night. These were interpreted as warnings, though their meaning was uncertain. In his palace, Moctezuma brooded over these signs. He was a man of deep faith, steeped in ritual and divination. He consulted priests, soothsayers, and omens, seeking to understand the will of the gods. In this atmosphere of unease, news would arrive that strangers had landed on the eastern coast. They came in floating mountains upon the sea, bearing weapons and animals the Mexica had never seen. Their skin was pale, their language unknown. At first, it was only rumor, but soon messengers returned with reports too strange to dismiss. For the Mexica, whose world was built on cycles, prophecy, and destiny, the arrival of strangers carried heavy meaning. Some whispered of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god who had departed long ago, promising one day to return. Others warned that these men were no gods but dangerous invaders. Moctezuma himself hesitated, torn between reverence and fear, uncertain whether these newcomers were divine guests or mortal enemies. While he pondered, while priests read the stars and sacrifices were made to seek guidance, the strangers advanced steadily along the coast, making alliances, learning the lay of the land. They were few, but they possessed weapons of thunder, beasts of burden that terrified the natives, and a determination born of their own hunger for wealth and glory. The people of the empire did not yet know it, but the arrival of these foreigners would test the very foundations of their world. The Aztec Empire stood at its greatest height, its city gleaming upon the lake, its temples towering above the waters, its markets filled with every luxury. But just beyond the horizon, destiny was approaching an encounter that would bring together two worlds that had never before touched. And in that collision, one would rise while the other would fall. When the first messengers returned to Moctezuma's palace with tales of the strangers on the coast, their words seemed almost unbelievable. They spoke of men with skin the color of lime, dressed in shining metal, carrying sticks that roared with thunder and spat smoke. They told of animals taller than men, with hooves like stone and speed like the wind, creatures never before seen in these lands. They brought back trinkets of iron and glass, and spoke of the stranger's desire for gold, for the Mexica who had long measured wealth in feathers, cacao, and jade. This obsession with yellow metal seemed strange, almost childish. Yet the stranger's hunger for it was unmistakable. Moctezuma listened in silence. In ritual and prophecy, turned again and again to the old stories. The year was one reed, a year marked in their calendar as the time when Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, might return. Was it possible these men were his envoys, or even Quetzalcoatl himself returned to reclaim his throne? Or were they mortals, dangerous and ambitious, seeking only to deceive? To do nothing was risky. To act rashly was equally dangerous. So Moctezuma chose caution. He sent emissaries bearing gifts of gold, fine garments, and feathered cloaks. Perhaps, he thought, generosity would appease these beings. Perhaps gifts would satisfy their strange hunger. But if he hoped to turn them away, he miscalculated. For the Spaniards, as they called themselves, saw the treasures as signs of greater wealth to be found. The more Moctezuma offered, the more their desire grew. The strangers were led by a man named Hernan Cortes. He was ambitious, cunning, and ruthless. He had defied the orders of his own governor to march inland, choosing risk over obedience. He brought with him only a few hundred men. Yet he understood something crucial. Power was not always about numbers, but about alliances. Cortes saw the discontent among the peoples of Mexico, the resentment toward Tenochtitlan's demands for tribute and sacrifice. Where the Aztec Empire ruled by fear, he would rule by promises. On his march inland, Cortes forged ties with peoples who had long suffered under Mexica power. In Zempoala, the Totonacs welcomed him as a possible savior. And most importantly, in Tlaxcala, the old enemy of the Mexica, he found allies willing to fight to the death against Tenochtitlan. The Tlaxcalans had resisted countless campaigns of the empire. They had bled for generations, and they saw in the strangers a chance to turn the tide. Though battles were fought at first, eventually Tlaxcala and court embraced each other, bound by a common hatred of the Aztecs. Mao Zedong, meanwhile, grew more troubled. Reports came of villages destroyed, of idols toppled, of people swearing allegiance to these newcomers. Yet still, he hesitated. Words of welcome, but also of warning. He even attempted to persuade courts to remain on the coast, to enjoy the treasures there without entering the valley. But courtiers would not be swayed. Each step inland brought him closer to the capital, and each alliance brought him greater strength. Finally, the day came when the stranger stood at the gates of Tenochtitlan itself. Imagine the sight: a vast city rising out of the lake, causeways stretching across the waters, temples towering above whitewashed palaces, canals gleaming like silver veins. To the Spaniards, who had never seen anything like it, the city seemed more wondrous than any in Europe. To approach its gates was to enter another world, a place of order, splendor, and mystery. Moctezuma, torn by doubt, chose to receive them as honored guests. He came forth in procession, adorned in rich garments, his bearing solemn and majestic. Before him walked nobles and priests, their faces painted, their voices chanting prayers. When Moctezuma and courts met, the air must have been thick with tension. Two men stood face to face, each the product of a different world, each trying to read the other's intentions. Moctezuma offered gifts, words of welcome, perhaps hoping to bind the strangers through courtesy and ritual. Courts, however, saw hesitation as a weakness. He bowed, he spoke kindly, but in his heart he was already measuring how to seize this mighty city for himself. The Spaniards entered Tenochtitlan as guests, housed in palaces, fed with the empire's abundance. But their presence was like a spark dropped into dry tinder. Every feast, every gift, every ritual meeting was shadowed by mistrust. The Spaniards were fascinated by the temples, by the markets, by the very canals of the city. They were also horrified by the sacrifices, the blood flowing down the steps of the pyramids, the altars blackened with offerings to gods they did not understand. Moctezuma found himself caught in an impossible position. To his people, his hospitality seemed like weakness. To the Spaniards, his hesitation was opportunity. before long, Quartz made his boldest move. He seized Moctezuma within his own palace, holding the emperor hostage in his own city. It was a gamble almost unthinkable, yet it succeeded, for Moctezuma, bound by ritual and perhaps by fear, allowed himself to remain under guard, even continuing to rule outwardly while under the control of the strangers. The people of Tenochtitlan, however, began to murmur. Their emperor, once the embodiment of divine authority, was now a prisoner. Priests whispered that the gods were displeased, that omens had been ignored. Warriors gritted their teeth, ready to act, but uncertain whether to defy their own rulers. Silence. The Spaniards, meanwhile, grew bolder, demanding more gold, tearing down idols, and replacing them with their own crosses and images of saints. Tension mounted until it burst. During a festival, while the people danced and sang in the great plaza, the Spaniards, fearing rebellion, fell upon them with swords and spears. Blood filled the square. The sacred songs turned to screams. Rage exploded throughout the city. Spaniards found themselves besieged, their position suddenly precarious in the chaos. Moctezuma was brought forth to calm his people, but the crowd no longer listened. Stones flew, insults rang out. The emperor, once revered, now appeared powerless. In the tumult, he was struck whether by his own people or by the Spaniards remains uncertain, and soon after Moctezuma was dead. The man who had received the strangers with cautious reverence, who had hesitated at the crossroads of fate, was gone. With his death, the fragile balance shattered. The city rose against the invaders. Warriors swarmed the streets, canoes filled the canals, and the Spaniards, trapped and desperate, fought to escape. Their flight from Tenochtitlan would become known as the Night of Sorrows. Rain poured as they fled along the causeways, burdened by the gold they had stolen. Many fell into the waters and drowned. Others were cut down by Aztec warriors. Few who marched out that night were unscathed. Yet the story did not end there. Though driven from the city, Quartz and his allies regrouped. The Tlaxcalans and other enemies of the Mexica stood firm beside him, eager for revenge. The Spaniards had lost men, but they had not lost their will. They would return, and when they did, they would not come as guests, but as conquerors. The empire still stood. Its city still gleamed upon the lake, but its heart was wounded. The death of Moctezuma left a void, and into that void stepped uncertainty, anger, and fear. The Mexica had faced countless enemies before, but never one like this enemy, who brought not only weapons of iron and beasts of war, but a web of alliances and a strange, unyielding faith in a single God, who demanded the destruction of all. Others, the sun still rose above Tenochtitlan, but dark clouds gathered on the horizon. The struggle for the city and for the very survival of the empire had only just begun. After the night of sorrows, when the Spaniards fled, bleeding and broken from the city, the Mexica roared with triumph. Their canals had run red with the blood of invaders. Their causeways littered with the bodies of those who had sought to claim their empire. The gods, it seemed, had spoken through victory. Yet, even in their moment of triumph, shadows of uncertainty lingered. Moctezuma was gone, and with him the delicate thread of authority that had bound empire and ritual together. The people needed new leadership, someone to rally them against the storm that still rumbled beyond the mountains. Cuitlahuac was chosen as the next ruler. He was a man of resolve, determined to resist the strangers and restore confidence to his people. Under his command, Tenochtitlan prepared for war. Defenses were strengthened, warriors armed themselves, and the city braced for the inevitable return of the enemy. For all their strange weapons and their fearsome beasts, the Spaniards had shown they could bleed, and the Mexica believed they could be destroyed. But fate was cruel. Even as the people rejoiced in victory, an unseen enemy entered their city. It came not with obsidian blades or Spanish steel, but in the breath and touch of the sick. Smallpox, carried by the strangers, swept through Tenochtitlan like a fire through dry reeds. The disease was merciless. It scarred, blinded, and killed with terrifying speed. Those who had never seen it before could not fight it, neither with medicine nor with prayer. Whole families perished, nobles and commoners alike, even priests who tended the temples. In the midst of this horror, Cuitlahuac himself succumbed, leaving the city once more without a steady hand. It was then that Cuitnag, young but courageous noble, was chosen as Latwani. Barely more than a youth, he carried the weight of an empire upon his shoulders. His name meant descending eagle, and like an eagle stooping from the sky. He vowed to strike at the enemy with all his strength. The people looked to him with hope, for he embodied the warrior spirit of the Mexica at its fiercest. Meanwhile, Hernan Court and his allies had not vanished into the night. Though battered, they regrouped in Tlaxcala, where they were welcomed as partners in the long struggle against the Mexica. New ships and weapons arrived from the coast. More allies joined, eager to see the empire fall. Courts understood that to defeat Tenochtitlan, he could not rely on Spaniards alone. He would weave together a coalition of thousands of native warriors, each with their own reasons for revenge. The Mexica, once lords of countless peoples, now found those same peoples arrayed against them. The siege of Tenochtitlan began with cunning. Courts ordered the building of brigantines, small warships that could sail upon Lake Texcoco. Piece by piece, they were carried over mountains and reassembled upon the waters. For the first time, the Mexica faced enemies who could challenge them on their own lake, cutting off canoes that had once supplied the city with food and goods. The causeways were seized, one, by the Spaniards and their allies, choking the city's lifelines. Inside Tenochtitlan, Cuauhtémoc urged his people to resist. Warriors stood upon the rooftops, hurling stones and spears. Canoes darted across the canals, ambushing Spanish brigantines when they could. Women carried water, prepared food, and tended the wounded. Children watched from behind walls, learning the harsh lessons of survival. The entire city became a battlefield, every street and every canal contested. Yet, as the siege tightened, hunger gnawed at the people. The chinampas lay abandoned. The tribute no longer arrived, and famine crept into the capital. Disease had already thinned their numbers, and now starvation claimed more lives each day. Still, the Mexica fought on, their determination burning as fiercely as ever. For them, surrender was unthinkable. Better to die with honor, better to offer their own blood to the gods, than to live in humiliation under foreign masters. The Spaniards advanced slowly, methodically. They destroyed houses to clear paths for their cannons. They toppled temples, defiled idols, and replaced them with their own symbols. Each step forward was won with blood, as Mexica warriors fought from every doorway, every rooftop, every canal. The city, once a jewel of the lake, began to crumble under fire and blade. The air filled with smoke and cries of the dying Cuauhtémoc himself fought among his warriors, refusing to yield. His courage inspired the people, but courage alone could not feed empty stomachs or heal the wounds of war. Day by day, the circle closed tighter. Blood, finally, in the summer of 1521, after months of resistance, Tenochtitlan could resist no longer. The Spaniards pressed into the heart of the city, their allies numbering in the tens of thousands. The Mexica, exhausted, starving, and outnumbered, still fought with desperate fury. But even the fiercest warrior could not hold back the tide. Forever. Cuauhtémoc, seeing the end upon them, tried to flee across the lake in a canoe. He was captured, brought before courts, and made to stand as the final Tlatoani of a fallen empire. When the Spaniards entered the ruins of the city, they found little to celebrate. The victory had cost them dearly. Their men slain by disease, hunger, and the unrelenting defense of the Mexica. The streets were littered with corpses, the canals choked with bodies, the air thick with a stench of death. The great temples lay broken, the palaces in ruin. The once proud city reduced to rubble. For the Mexica who survived, life would never be the same. Their gods were torn down, their temples desecrated, their traditions outlawed. The Spaniards built their churches atop the ruins, their city upon the ashes of Tenochtitlan. The people who had once ruled an empire stretching across mountains and valleys now became subjects in a foreign land. Yet even in defeat, the memory of Tenochtitlan endured. The songs of poets, the stories of warriors, the pride of a people who had risen from nothing to build a city of dreams could not be erased so easily. Though their empire had fallen, their spirit lived on in their descendants, in the language that survived, in the traditions that still whispered through the generations. The eagle on the cactus had once marked the beginning of their city. It would remain a symbol not only of what was lost, but of what endured. For though Tenochtitlan fell, the memory of its rise and its glory could never truly be destroyed. When the smoke of battle finally cleared and the cries of the wounded faded into silence, the ruins of Tenochtitlan lay beneath the feet of the conquerors. The great city that had once stood like a jewel upon the waters was broken, its temples toppled, its causeways shattered, its canals filled with corpses and rubble. Yet from these ashes a new order began to rise. For the Spaniards, victory was not only about survival, which about transformation. They envisioned a new city, not dedicated to Huitzilopochtli or Talag, but to the god they worshipped. Upon the ruins of the great temples, they began to build churches. Stones from palaces and pyramids were repurposed into cathedrals and government buildings. The island in the lake that had once been Tenochtitlan became the foundation of Mexico City, the heart of a new colony that would stretch far beyond the horizons that Mexico had ever known. But for the Mexica people, the fall of their empire was not an ending so much as a profound rupture. Survivors faced famine, disease, and enslavement. Many were forced to labor under their new masters, carrying stones, farming lands, or serving in households. The ancient nobility was diminished, though some lineages survived, adapting to the new order in hopes of preserving fragments of their heritage. Priests who once sang the hymns of the gods now faced persecution, their temples desecrated, their rituals outlawed. And yet, even in the shadow of conquest, the Mexica spirit did not vanish. Their language, Nahuatl, continued to be spoken by millions, and even the conquerors came to rely on it as a lingua franca across the vast new territories of New Spain. Their agricultural practices, especially the chinampas, endured feeding generations to come. Their artistry in featherwork, in stone, in painted codices survived as a testament to their vision and skill. Cuauhtémoc, the last emperor, became a symbol of resistance. Though captured alive, his dignity remained unbroken. Courts, suspicious that treasures still lay hidden, ordered him tortured, his feet burned to force a confession. Yet Cuauhtémoc bore the agony with silence, refusing to betray his people's secrets. Later, on the long march to Honduras, he was executed, hanged by the Spaniards. His death marked the final extinguishing of the imperial line. But in memory, he became a figure of defiance. The young eagle who had descended bravely into the storm. The conquest rippled far beyond the Valley of Mexico. Diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza spread through the land, decimating populations who had never known such afflictions. Villages emptied, fields lay fallow, entire cultures were shaken. The Spaniards, few in number, ruled not by sheer force, but by the combination of military dominance, native alliances, and the terrible impact of disease. Within a single generation, the balance of power across Mesoamerica had been transformed. Yet, even as the conquerors imposed their rule, they themselves were changed. They took wives from among the conquered, and their children, mestizos, became the foundation of a new people, neither fully Spanish nor fully indigenous, but something in between. Nahuatl words entered Spanish speech, maize and cacao entered European diets, while horses and iron reshaped the landscape of the Americas. Two worlds collided upon the lakes of Tenochtitlan, and from that collision a new world was born. Still, the memory of what had been lingered. The elders remembered the days when the city shone upon the waters, when the marketplaces overflowed with goods, when the songs of the priests echoed from the temples. They told their children of the eagle and the cactus, of the rise from wandering hunters to rulers of an empire. In their sorrow, they also preserved pride, for though their empire had fallen, its story could not be erased. In time, chroniclers, both Spanish and indigenous, recorded the tales. Some sought to justify the conquest, others to preserve the memory of what was lost. Through these accounts, the Mexica voices still whisper across the centuries, reminding us that history is never only written by the victors. Beneath the rubble of the conquest, the heartbeat of a people still endures. And so the story of the Aztec Empire is one of both brilliance and tragedy. In little more than 2 centuries, they rose from wanderers to empire builders, creating one of the most remarkable civilizations the world had ever seen. Their city, Tenochtitlan, dazzled with its splendor, a place where causeways and canals reflected the heavens. where markets bustled with goods from across the land, where rituals bound the people to their gods. Yet their empire was built on conquest and fear, and when the strangers came, those old wounds became the cracks through which their enemies poured. The fall was swift, brutal, and complete, yet it was not the end. For in modern Mexico, the symbols of the Mexica still live. On the national flag, the eagle perched upon the cactus recalls the founding vision of Tenochtitlan. In the rhythms of Nahuatl words, in the patterns of woven cloth, in the flavors of maize and cacao, the legacy of the Mexica remains. Their empire may have crumbled, but their spirit endures in every story told, every song remembered, every stone that still whispers of the city upon the lake. The rise and fall of the Aztec Empire is not merely the tale of a lost people, but a reminder of the resilience of culture, the fragility of power, and the enduring strength of memory. The lakes may be drained, the temples gone, the palaces replaced by new walls. Yet, when one walks the streets of Mexico City, one still walks upon Tenochtitlan. Beneath every stone lies a layer of history. Beneath every church, a buried temple. Beneath every silence, the echo of drums and the cry of warriors. And if you listen closely, as the sun sets over the valley, you may still hear the voice of the Mexica, proud and unbroken, whispering through time. We were here, we lived, we built, we fell, and we endure.